So we begin from where we left in Sartre Why Write. So on page 46, Sartre said that the work is never a natural datum, but an exigence and a gift. And we explained these ideas. Exigence refers to the chance event that is associated with making any choice, either of writing or reading a book. And gift reminds one of the generosity which is associated with the act of writing as well as reading, because it is out of generosity that the writer begins to write and the reader takes up the book for reading. And the word generosity, I explained, it has an implication, an ethical implication. That is, we do something not only for ourselves but also for others. So when somebody decides to write, that is a public act. It is written for others. At the same time, reading, though it seems to be a private act, but it is also a participation in the work which is a public work for public consumption. Therefore, reading, even though apparently it is a private act, but it is not, because you are participating in this public process by which a work has its impact upon the people. So, thus the writers, it is not so. And if I am given this world with its injustices, it is not so that I may contemplate them coldly, but that I may animate them with my indignation, that I may disclose them and create them with their nature as injustices, that is, as abuses to be suppressed. So a reader does not participate in a work in a cold way without any passionate commitment, but he always, one may say, impregnates the work or injects into the work his passions. So these passions would be either of indignation when there is depiction of injustice, or of admiration when there is resistance to injustice or opposition to injustice in the writer's work, and so on. So the writer's universe will only reveal itself in all its depth, the examination, the admiration, and the indignation of the reader. So the reader examines the work, expresses his indignation when there is injustice, and his admiration when there is opposition to injustice, or when the writer intervenes for the freedom of those who are oppressed. And the generous love is a promise to maintain, and the generous indignation is a promise to change, and the admiration a promise to imitate. So you see how formulaic this statement appears. Before every phrase, Sartre is repeating the word generous, reminding the reader, his reader that reading a work is participating in a generous process, which is an ethical act. So the reader has generous love for a promise to maintain. What is the promise? The promise is that of freedom. The writer promises this freedom through his intervention, and the reader must maintain this promise by going with the writer all the way, by supporting his cause. And the generous indignation is a promise to change. So where there is a depiction of injustice, then the reader feels indignation, but that is a promise to change, which means that reading must not stop only there, but it should carry on, or it should produce in the mind of the reader a conviction that things must change. And the admiration, a promise to imitate. So if the reader feels admiration for the writer, he must imitate him. How must he imitate him? Will he write like him? No. Here the word imitation is not in that sense. Here it is in the sense of imitating his struggle for freedom or his cause for freedom. So we see how, even though Sartre's book is non-teleological, yet a didactic point of view is expressed here, that the work must uphold a point of view that would strive for freedom of every person, universal freedom. Although literature is one thing and morality a quite different one, at the heart of the aesthetic imperative we discern the moral imperative. So we may say that now the cat is out of the bag. So even though there is so much talk about non-teleology, purposelessness without purpose and everything, yet ultimately Sartre is talking about commitment. So Sartre is not talking about indifference or neutrality in a work of art. He is talking about commitment to a cause. And what is the cause? The cause is universal freedom. Therefore, Sartre says, you can see that at the end of the essay, he makes it clear that even though I have been so long talking about an aesthetic imperative, but within that aesthetic imperative, or at the heart of that aesthetic imperative, we discern the moral imperative. Alright. So you cannot actually say that, yes, I caught Sartre here. He was trying to convince us that it is all about aesthetics, but actually he is writing a moral essay. But we cannot even say that, because Sartre himself says that we discern. So here he becomes the reader of this entire enterprise of writing, and he says that at the heart of writing and reading we discern a moral imperative. Therefore, this is the, we may say, the force of this essay. Even if we do not say the goal of the essay, we may say that this is the, force, this is the lifeline, this is the spirit of the essay, that what is literature, this book is about commitment in a particular socio-political context. But this question of commitment has been given a universal significance, where every reader participates in this question of freedom. How this universal significance has been possible in Sartre's essay? Because he grounded his essay on existential philosophy, where it is said that human freedom consists in the gap between the subject and the other, or the subject and the object, and therefore to appropriate the object in the self, in one's movement towards being in itself, to appropriate the object in the self or to appropriate the other in the self, one must exercise one's freedom. So, and exercise it in favor of universal freedom, so that nobody remains unfree, or nobody is a slave to any system. For since the one who writes recognizes by the very fact that he takes the trouble to write the freedom of his readers, the writer recognizes the freedom of the readers. And since the one who reads by the mere fact of opening the book recognizes the freedom of the writer. So you see here that this recognition is mutual. And because of this mutual recognition, the writer and the reader respect, each other. They participate or they collaborate in a process. From the work of art, from whichever side you approach it, is an act of confidence in the freedom of man. So this is, we may say, the message of this chapter, Why Write. What is the message? That a work of art or a work of literature instills confidence in freedom. And Sartre further goes on to explain that is it possible to write a novel in some cause which is not noble, which is an evil cause? Is it possible to write a good novel on an evil cause? He says it is impossible. And since readers like the author recognize this freedom only to demand that it manifests itself, the work can be defined as an imaginary representation of the world insofar as it demands human freedom. So Sartre presents it as a universal situation that the entire world demands human freedom, and a work of art or work of literature only manifests in an imaginary way. It presents this demand for universal freedom. The result of which is that there is no gloomy literature, since however dark may be the colors in which one paints the world, one paints it only so that free men may feel their freedom as they taste. So he says that there is only bad novel and good novel. There is no gloomy literature. What does it mean? Well, gloomy literature is in inverted commas. It means that if literature is not for an evil cause, not for a good cause by chance, if literature is for evil cause. Let us suppose that any book, any novel can be for an evil cause, then it will be gloomy. But Sartre says that there is no such literature. By definition, it is not possible for literature to serve an evil cause, and that is why he puts gloomy literature within single inverted commas, because it is a hypothetical supposition. There is no such thing as gloomy literature. Therefore, there are only good and bad novels. The bad novel aims to please the flattering, whereas the good one is an exigence and an act of faith. So, exigence means which happens for a chance, act of faith, because when the writer takes up the project of writing something, he doesn't know where it will lead to. So he takes a jump of faith. But above all, the unique point of view from which the author can present the world to those freedoms whose concurrence he wishes to bring about is that of a world to be impregnated always with more freedom. So, the author's task is to write from a unique point of view and present the world to those freedoms which would conquer, which he wishes to conquer with the world. I mean, the idea here is that all those freedoms, you see freedom here in plural, all those freedoms which have not yet been materialized, the work is a kind of a wishful representation, or we may say an exposition of all those unmaterialized freedoms that the writer wishes would conquer, that is, they would all come together and be realized. Therefore, a work of art is essentially from a unique point of view. The writer adopts this unique point of view which enables him to expose, so to say, or to exhibit, to bring into focus all these freedoms which are still unmaterialized. And by bringing them into focus, by exposing them, the writer wishes or fondly wishes that they would come into concurrence, which means that all of them would materialize simultaneously and there will be universal freedom in this world. The task of the writer or the desire of the writer is to impregnate this world with more and more freedom. So where does this idea of more and more freedom rise from? It rises necessarily because there is lack of it. Because in this world there is so much lack of freedom, because there is oppression, that is why it rises in the mind of any conscientious person that in all these different areas there should be complete freedom. So the writer adopts a point of view from which he exposes the areas where there is lack of freedom and where there should be freedom. And he hopes that they would conquer, that they would all simultaneously be materialized so that there is universal freedom. So basically the writer's act, appears here to be a utopian, desire, expression of desire, but utopian within single inverted commas, because Sartre is definitely definitely does not want the reader to think that he is suggesting that it is utopian. It is not utopian. He definitely believes, or he suggests that the writer and the reader must believe in freedom. So it is not something impossible or improbable. But at the same time, in the same breath, he says that it is an act of faith. And that is why I am using the word utopian in quotations. So something which is not there, when we dream of it, then it is an act of faith. It may not be utopian, it may be materialized, but until it is materialized, it remains imaginary. It would be inconceivable that this unleashing of generosity provoked by the writer could be used to authorize an injustice, and that the reader could enjoy his freedom while reading a work which approves or accepts or simply abstains from condemning the subjection of man by man. It is inconceivable, Sartre says, unthinkable, unimaginable, that this whole act of writing, which is founded upon a generous act, which is founded upon generosity, this whole act of writing could be used for upholding injustice or any kind of oppression of man by man. The point is it only inconceivable or is it impossible? So, when he says it is inconceivable, he is actually still, romantically reacting to the idea, but soon he comes to state that it is impossible. Because without this conviction, his whole essay will fall flat. So, he says that with this help of an example, he establishes that how it is impossible. One can imagine a good novel being written by an American Negro, even if hatred of the whites was spread all over it, because it is the freedom of his race that demands to this hatred. So a good novel may they did something very bad, like hatred. But if the ultimate purpose of that work is to expose some oppression, like the oppression of the blacks by the whites in America. So Sartre does not talk about Europe or the colonial exploitation in Europe in the early periods. So, America can easily be attacked from a European point of view. It is always easy to talk about the bad things in America. So he gives us the example of racism in America, as if racism is not there in Europe. Anyway, so he says that a novelist who expresses hatred of the whites in his novel, where he tries to uphold the cause of the black people and expose their oppression by the whites, then even though it reveals something bad or evil, yet it is a good novel, because it demands the freedom of his race. And as he invites me to assume the attitude of generosity, the moment I feel myself a pure freedom, I cannot bear to identify myself with a race of oppressors. So when a white man like Sartre reads this book by an American black author, now I do not know why in this translation we have the word Negro, this translation by Bernard Friedman, because now to use the word Negro is politically incorrect. Now people use the word black or something else. Now this is very hypocritical, because the word Negro only means black in Latin. Well, but the word came to be associated with racism, because at that time black or the word Negro was used as a word of abuse. So the whites called the black Negro, therefore it became a word of abuse. But etymologically it is nothing different from black. Of course, we Indians use a lot more of hypocrisy when we, instead of mentioning any religion by name, we just say minorities. Now, so when you say minorities, why should people assume that you are talking about Muslims? Because there are Christians, there are Sikhs, there are Buddhists, so many other religions are there. But minorities has become a euphemism for Muslims. So we are much more hypocritical. So let us forgive the Western people for their euphemism. As he invites me, so Sartre said that when as reader I pick up this book, I do that out of generosity, and I exercise this freedom, and therefore I feel myself as pure freedom, and then I cannot identify with the whites who are a race of oppressors. So there is a danger in feeling pure freedom. Okay? So be careful before you feel this pure freedom, because you always belong to some particular race, and every race has committed some kind of blunder in history. But feeling pure freedom means that you keep aside your other identities, racial, caste, or any other identities. Otherwise, how can you be free? So if you maintain or if you preserve all those identities of race, caste, clan, and so on and so forth, so you are a Brahmin or a Tamil or a whatever, so if you retain all those identities, then you can never be free. So feeling pure freedom means that you are free also of those limited identities. And then you identify with freedom, therefore you cannot support the oppression by the white race. Thus I require of all freedoms that they demand the liberation of colored people against the white race and against myself insofar as I am a part of it. But nobody can suppose for a moment that it is possible to write a good novel in place of anti-Semitism. So Sartre says that even though a part of me is white, even then I support this cause of freedom as a reader, because as a reader I feel pure freedom, which means that I am also free of those other identities. But there is no doubt that I was born as a white European. So as a white person, I must share the blame for the white race that oppressed the black people. But he raises this question: is it ever possible to write a good novel on anti-Semitism? That is the oppression of the Jews, the persecution of the Jews, which has been there in Europe particularly for centuries. For the moment, I feel that my freedom is indissolubly linked with that of all other men. It cannot be demanded of me that I use it to approve the enslavement of a part of these men. So this was the premise from which this whole essay was written. Or this is an existential premise that as a being I must move on, I must move towards becoming being in itself. But since being in itself is impossible for a person with consciousness to be, because being in itself is an object. This universe is being in itself. Everything is included in it. Therefore, for a person with consciousness, he can only be being for itself, where the tendency is the same, that he must identify his small being with the large being of this universe. So being with small b must tend towards being with capital B. So that was the existential premise, which would mean that my freedom is indissolubly linked with the freedom of other people. Because if the world is not completely free, as long as there remains an iota of slavery, an iota of lack of freedom in this world, my being remains imperfect. My being cannot become completely free, because I want to include the whole world in my being. So I cannot approve enslavement of any part of man. Thus, whether he is an essayist, a pamphleteer, a satirist, or a novelist, whether he speaks only of individual passions, now notice that here nowhere a poet is mentioned. Essayist, pamphleteer, satirist, novelist, but not a poet, because in chapter 1, Sartre, reacted against poetry, suggested that poetry is not a language of communication, therefore it cannot be permitted. And we know that later he changed this view, particularly after the criticism by Merleau-Ponty. So here he says that any writer, in whichever genre he is writing, apart from poetry, whether he speaks only of individual passions or whether he attacks the social order, the writer of free man addressing free man has only one subject, freedom. So whether the writer is talking about his subjective feelings, individual passions, for example, the romantics of the 19th century, they mostly spoke about their own subjectivity. But we know that poets like Shelley and others, they wrote for freedom, for liberty, in the sense they were highly influenced by the French Revolution, Wordsworth also, and so on. Those Sartre here omits all poets from his discussion. He is mainly thinking about novelists, and that also French novelists, basically. So if you can be Jean-Paul Sartre of Bengal, then you can write such an essay with only Bengali novelists in mind. But then you have rise to that stature of Sartre. So the only object of writing is only subject of writing is freedom. So whether the writer is subjective or objective in his point of view, what he writes about is essentially about freedom. Hence, any attempt to enslave his readers threatens him in his very art. A blacksmith can be affected by fascism. So, if the writer takes up a view that supports oppression of a class of people or a race of people, then the writer is hurting his own ground of writing, because writing is based upon freedom, upon generosity. So, to support oppression of any kind goes against the act of writing, which is by definition founded on generosity. I have seen writers who before the war called for fascism with all their hearts, smitten with sterility at the very moment when the Nazis were loading them with honors. So he talks about writers who support oppressive regimes, like those who supported the fascists or the Nazis before the Second World War, and the Nazi government or the fascist governments awarded or rewarded these writers with many awards. But when the true color of the fascists became visible, then what was the condition of these writers? They had to shrink. They had no space left because they had sided with the oppressors, and by doing that they lost the very essential authority of writing. They lost the purpose of writing. You cannot write for a class of oppressors. If you try to write for a class of oppressors, what happens? You have to remember that the majority of your readers are not the rulers, they are the ruled. So you lose your readers. And finally you come to a position where you write only for a few generals, for a few political leaders. The masses have boycotted you because you are not writing for them any longer. And this is an anathema for any writer. A writer cannot continue if he does not have any readers. So Sartre gives this example of this writer, Drew. I am thinking of Drew La Rochelle in particular. He was mistaken, but he was sincere. Well, writers and poets, they may make mistakes. By nature, they are passionate. So whenever they support somebody, they support passionately. Now you may support passionately for Trinamool or for BJP, but later you may find that you were mistaken. Your conscience tells you that you are mistaken. Then what do? You lose your face. But you still may be sincere. So when you write a paean of your chief minister or your prime minister, then you think you have done the right thing because he or she is a great leader and so on. But later you discover that you were wrong. But by the time you have lost many of your readers, So that is what happened to La Rochelle. He had agreed to direct a Nazi-inspired review. The first few months he reprimanded, rebuked, and lectured his countrymen. So because he was a passionate writer, he thought that the Nazi leaders, they were great leaders, but his countrymen were not supporting them. So what would he do? He reprimanded them. He scolded his countrymen in his writings. No one answered him because no one was free to do so. So in a country ruled by fascists, nobody can freely speak anything. If you try to speak freely, then you know where you will find yourself. Okay, so nobody answered him, which means that the country being ruled by fascists, they were afraid of speaking. Given the right to speak without fear, they would have heavily opposed him. So the writer didn't even get any opposition, which means he didn't get any reaction to what he was writing. He was writing very passionately, but there were no reactions. He became irritated. He no longer felt his readers. So it is important for the writer to feel his readers. He no longer felt his readers. He became more insistent, but no sign appeared to prove that he had been understood. No sign of hatred, nor of anger either. Nothing. He seemed to have lost his bearings. The victim of a growing distress, he complained bitterly to the Germans. His articles had been superb. They became shrill. The moment arrived when he struck his breast, no echo, except among the bought journalists whom he despised. So there were always some bought journalists, so they praised him. But he, being a sincere writer, he did not want their praise. He despised them. He handed in his resignation, withdrew it, again spoke, still in the desert. Finally, he said nothing, gagged by the silence of others. So if people are made silent, then writers would also eventually fall silent. He had demanded the enslavement of others, but in his crazy mind he must have imagined that it was voluntary, that it was still free. So he did not realize that under fascist regime there can be no freedom. So when he wants his readers to freely choose or to freely support his point of view, the readers no longer have this freedom. But he is working under an illusion or we may say delusion, that freedom is still there. So the man in him congratulated himself mightily, but the writer could not bear it. So this is a schizophrenic situation. There is a division between the writer and the man. So the man congratulates himself as having written something very important and very powerful, but the writer in him knew that it was false, that it was not the case. While this was going on, others who happily were in the majority understood that the freedom of writing implies the freedom of the citizen. Unless citizens are free, unless people are free, a writer cannot have any freedom. One does not write for slaves. The art of prose is bound up with the only regime in which prose has meaning, democracy. So you see how Sartre intertwines art with ethics or with politics in the sense that only in a democratic setup prose can have any impact. When one is threatened, the other is too. And it is not enough to defend them with the pen. A day comes when the pen is forced to stop, and the writer must then take up arms. So when you try to defend with your pen, at some time you have to stop when the pen does not have any more effect, and then you take up arms. here what Sartre is saying, that the expression that the sword is mightier than the pen is wrong, because the sword gets blunt. The pen is mightier than the sword. So the pen gets blunt, then the sword gets sharper. Then you have to take up the sword. So whichever is sharper, you take up that weapon. So the pen becomes blunt, because when there is no freedom, then writing has no impact. Then you have to fight against the fascists with arms. That's however you might have come to it, whatever the opinions you might have professed, literature throws you into battle. Writing is a certain way of wanting freedom. Once you have begun, you are committed to living it. So writing proves that writing is always about commitment. It means entering into a battle, taking a side. And once you enter this side, then you must continue this fight. Committed to what? Defending freedom? That is easy to say. Is it a matter of acting as guardian of ideal values, like Benda's clerk before the betrayal? So here it is an allusion to a novel by Benda, La Trahison des Clercs, The Betrayal of the Clerks. Or is it concrete everyday freedom which must be protected by our taking sides in political and social struggles? The question is tied up with another one very simple in appearance, but which nobody ever asks himself: for whom does one write? So, what is this? What does this mean? Defending freedom. What kind of freedom? Only intellectual freedom or universal freedom? So, Sartre ends this chapter by saying, for that we will have to ask another question: for whom does one write? Which is the name of his next chapter. Alright. So, we finish the essay, and you see the essay is very logically developed, or the argument of the book is logically developed, and you must read the entire book. You have to, if you have to fully comprehend what Sartre is saying, but even then, by reading this chapter, Why Write, we have understood what are the basic arguments that Sartre is making here. Any question? So, if you do not have any questions, then I have given you some questions. So, we look at those questions now. Well, can you see the questions?
Yes, sir. It's a little blurred, but it's good.
Yes. You also have them in your WhatsApp, but here you can see for the LRJ. Discuss our concept of literature and why write. So this is a global kind of question, broad question. Since I have talked at length, I feel a little out of breath, so perhaps you can join in to help me a little. So, what is Sartre's concept of literature in Why Write in this chapter? Very simple. You only have to look at the summary that I have given you. So, there everything is in a nutshell. Literature in this chapter, as well as in the book, what is literature? You see, the name of the book itself is significant, because the title suggests that Sartre is defining what is literature. Qu'est-ce que c'est la littérature in French? What is literature in English? The idea that we get here, let us not even look at chapter 1, which is what is writing. So chapter 1 also talks about what is writing. So basically what Sartre says is that for him, literature means committed literature. Literature engagée. Committed literature. And then he defines literature with the help of existential philosophy. And he connects the concept of literature with freedom. So as in existential philosophy, freedom is the gap between the subject and the object. So if we look at other people, philosophically they will appear to us as objects of our contemplation. So we can look at ourselves only as subjects. So as we try to become being for itself, we must include others into ourselves essentially, and therefore how can we do that? We can do that by exercising freedom, which is the gap between subject and object. We have the freedom of forming an attitude towards others, and that attitude usually should be for attaining freedom for everybody. How is that related, or why is that necessary at all? Because since being for itself would mean appropriating the world into ourselves, into our being, therefore if I want to be free, then everybody in the world also must be free. As long as any section of people remains unfree in this world, means that I cannot appropriate them into myself. Or I remain unfree, insofar as some people are unfree. Therefore, from this existential point of view, we must exercise our freedom towards attaining universal freedom, and we try to do that by writing. So that is the whole purport of the second chapter, Why Write. Why do we write? We write because we want to be completely ourselves. We want to enclose, we want to appropriate the entire world into ourselves. That is why we write. And this writing is an act of freedom, and unless everybody is free, we cannot be free. Therefore, writing must always be for attaining universal freedom, because otherwise I cannot be free. That is the first premise about literature in this chapter. What is the second premise? The second premise is that writing is an act of collaboration between writer and reader. Why is it an act of collaboration between writer and reader? Because when the writer writes, he chooses to write. That is, he exercises his freedom to write, but he cannot give meaning to his work. Sartre discussed that in great detail in this chapter. Why the writer cannot give complete meaning to his work? Because he does not have a distance from his work. He finds himself too much in his work. He does not have the distance from which he can look at the work as an object. He can look at the work objectively. That is why he cannot read in the true sense of reading. So the writer's reading of his work is imperfect, because he always sees himself in his work. He knows what is going to happen. He knows everything about the work so much that he cannot have the expected emotions, the expectations, the wonder, the disappointment, the joy, all these emotions which are possible in a reader who does not know the work, who is reading it for the first time, that is not possible for the writer. Therefore, the reader can give the writing its meaning. So the writer is dependent upon the reader so that the work has a meaning, and therefore it is an act of collaboration. So that is the second premise. And the third premise is that writer and reader together participate in this project of writing and reading, and even though there is no goal or end of work in the utilitarian sense, yet there is an implied goal in the work, which is realization of freedom for everybody. So here comes the third premise. So we may say that the first premise is the freedom of the writer, the second premise is the freedom of the reader, and the third premise is that nobody can have freedom, neither the writer nor the reader, unless there is universal freedom. Therefore, the work is a catalyst to evoke the idea of universal freedom. Therefore, the work becomes meaningful insofar as it can evoke a sense of freedom and it can oppose oppression or slavery in any form. So when Sartre looks at a work aesthetically, Sartre talks about literature having an aesthetic, Sartre talks about the possibility of having an aesthetic judgment of literature, but then within this aesthetic imperative, as he says, there lies an ethical imperative. So that is the third premise. And in his discussion of the aesthetic qualities of literature, Sartre draws largely from Kant, even though he differs from Kant insofar as he is an existentialist. But then he goes beyond aesthetic discussion and ends the essay by suggesting that the aesthetic imperative has within it an ethical imperative. So the third premise is that freedom for everybody, universal freedom, is the goal of both the writer, the reader, and the work of art evokes this universal freedom and exposes all kinds of oppression and slavery. And then Sartre says that it is not possible to write a novel for an evil cause like anti-Semitism, because any project of writing is based on the idea of generosity, the idea of being generous towards others, and writing essentially demands universal freedom. So that is Sartre's concept of literature in this chapter. Is it clear?
Yes, yes, sir.
It is a prolonged discussion in favor of committed literature. Do you agree? Justify your answer. What do you think? This is a very simple question, because Sartre talks about literatura ogare, committed literature. But to write this question well, you have to read the first chapter, where Sartre says that prose is the kind of writing, prose writing, which can be committed. So in the first chapter, Sartre takes up the question, which forms of art can be committed? Prose, poetry, music, painting, and he decides that only prose can be perfectly committed, because in all other forms of art, even if, apart from poetry, even if there is a sense of commitment, there is a sense of, there is a kind of message, but that message cannot be properly seen or understood. On the other hand, Sartre says, prose is like a glass pane. You see everything transparently through it. And therefore you see the message, and therefore prose is the means by which committed literature can be written. Apart from that, what else we will discuss here? The whole essay is a discussion, or it is an argument in favor of committed literature. Why? Because in the final analysis, at the end of chapter 2, this essay Why Write, Sartre says that literature must evoke universal freedom for everybody. So, literature is therefore engaged to a cause. What is the cause? The cause of universal freedom. But is literature only didactic? Does it have any aesthetic quality? And so on and so forth. So these things are also discussed by Sartre earlier in the essay, using Kant's theory of aesthetic joy. So he says that literature as a work of art provides aesthetic joy. However, within the aesthetic imperative there is the moral imperative. So basically this question covers the entire essay, and more or less you have to talk about the idea of committed literature, how Sartre establishes the idea of committed literature in chapter 2, Why Write, by arguing that a writer engages in the act of writing by exercising his freedom, and since writing is an act of generosity and reading is also an act of generosity, therefore in the whole project of reading and writing, it is freedom which is of paramount importance, and from an existential point of view, neither the writer nor the reader can fully experience their freedom unless there is universal freedom. Therefore, they support the cause of freedom in their work, and the work becomes, a project in favor of freedom, because the whole work, any work, is founded upon the exigence, the idea of exigence, that is, by pure chance and free choice, somebody takes up writing. Similarly, by chance and free choice, somebody takes up reading a book. And therefore, writing and reading, they are dependent upon exigence, upon choice, and they are acts of freedom. And therefore, this freedom is not possible in a complete sense from the point of view of existential philosophy unless everyone is able to participate in universal freedom. So from an existential point of view, Sartre talks about the idea of situatedness. The situatedness is true for the writer, the reader, or for any common man. So every human being is situated. And existentialism talks about the freedom of any person, any human being. What is his freedom? His freedom is the distance between the subject and the object. Therefore, philosophically, every man must appropriate others into his world. And therefore, unless everyone is free, if there is any lack of freedom in this world, then no man can be free in the true sense of the term. And since writing or reading or literature is a project which is possible through the exercise of freedom of the writer and the reader, therefore the writer or the reader, they cannot truly write or read literature unless literature evokes or suggests freedom for everyone. Therefore literature is committed. That is what Sartre speaks about till the end of the essay. And he even says that it is not possible to write literature which does not talk about freedom, or which talks about oppressing any section of the people. By definition, it cannot be literature. Therefore, literature for Sartre is committed literature because it is grounded on the philosophical idea of existentialism, which talks about freedom. Is it clear?
Yes, yes.
How is Sartre's concept of writing intimately connected with this concept of being? So here we have to talk about being for itself, being in itself, and being for others. The three, existential concepts, and these concepts are borrowed from Martin Heidegger. And how is writing connected with the concept of being? Since being involves situatedness in the world, and when one is situated in the world, one wants to appropriate the world into his self. So being for itself means a movement towards appropriation of the world into the self. Being in itself means that the world is already in the being, which is, the situation of the universe without consciousness, let us assume. So, it is complete, it is absolute. The world is already within the being. But for us, for human beings with consciousness, we can only be being for itself. That is, we can strive towards this complete being, capital B, being with capital B. How can we be being with capital B? When all beings with small b are included in it. So when particular beings all are felt to be part and participle, part of this being, then it can be being for itself. So basically, being means one tries to abolish the gap between subject and object. And Sartre says that this gap is the freedom, and therefore each of us is free to abolish this gap as much as possible. How can we do that? By making others as close as possible to ourselves. So we appropriate everybody into our being, into ourselves. And therefore, writing being an exercise in this freedom, it helps us in this process of being, this concept of being. Now, I formulated these questions, but in Calcutta University there are people much wiser than me and much more learned also. So you may not expect these questions, these exact questions, but they may be formulated in different manners. So you should be ready. I mean, if you understand the basic concepts given in this essay, then you will be able to write any answer, any question. What is the role of freedom? So this is just a repetition of what we have always been saying. Comment on such idea of aesthetic joy in Why Write. So for that you look at the here I have summarized. Sartre goes on to speak about the writer's aim of providing aesthetic pleasure of joy to the reader. The work of art produces two kinds of joy for the writer. One, joy produced because of the recognition that the work does not stand for a means, ends or utilitarian logic, but for an appeal or value. So the first joy results out of the awareness that means, ends logic has been defeated, has been vanquished. Which means that Sartre is against utilitarian logic. On the other hand, he believes that work is an appeal or value. Okay, so both these words are important. Appeal, as I told you, has two meanings in French. Appel means a call and also an appeal. So a work is a call. It calls out to the reader. It wants to convey some message to the reader. What is the message? The message is about value. So a work is about some value. And this produces a joy. That the work is not teleological. It does not have any utilitarian goal. Its only goal is to derive joy through this participatory process of writing, reading and exercising freedom. And this joy is produced by the positional consciousness, Sartre says, because the consciousness posits an object that is the value of the writer. So, by positional consciousness, one feels the joy of the work being non-teleological. The second joy is that of non-positional consciousness of his freedom. So, this consciousness of the reader does not posit the work of art as an object for examination to him, but this consciousness makes him aware of the fact that he is free, that the act of reading is an exercise of freedom. Therefore, he experiences joy for two reasons. One, that the work is non-utilitarian. Two, that it makes him aware of his freedom. So, if you want to further develop on this idea of aesthetic joy, then you will have to look at the Kantian aesthetics that I have given you, the notes on Kantian aesthetics. So, what does Kant say about the aesthetic experience or judgment of beauty? Kant says that there is a purposiveness without purpose in a judgment of beauty. So So I have given you from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy a file named Kant's Aesthetics. So there all these are repeated. Purposiveness without beauty, stoicness is quite honest stoic. And Sartre uses this phrase in French, finality without end, finalité sans fin. So this is the source of Sartre's idea that work produces aesthetic joy because it is non-utilitarian. So you have to mention these two things. That according to Sartre, the work produces joy because it is non-utilitarian. This joy is possible because of the reader's positional consciousness. When this consciousness posits the work as an object to him as for examination, he derives joy by reading the work. So it is basically aesthetic joy, the joy of reading a work, and this work does not have any utilitarian end. Now, what do you remember here? You remember that Sartre criticized the art for art's sake movement as a bourgeois movement which did not properly understand the idea of purposelessness in the work. So it realized that the work of art should not have any utilitarian purpose. To that extent, it was a movement, as a right step, that the work of art should not be utilitarian. But a work of art cannot be for art's sake. So there it went wrong, because nothing is for art's sake or science's sake, as Sartre explains that everything is for the sake of humanity and everything is for the sake of freedom. So philosophically he says that we can understand this freedom by our consciousness, which is non-positional consciousness, because it does not posit anything as an object to us. We are free simply because we are here. The notion of Dasein. So being here or being there, that itself is a cause of joy. That itself gives us a sense of freedom, that we are here. We are situated, yes, but still we can exercise our freedom. So these are the two sources of aesthetic joy in a work of art. Is it clear? Why does Sartre say that there is no gloomy literature but only good and bad literature? So that is a very easy question. But nevertheless, what is gloomy literature? So if any literature, well, Sartre says that by definition you cannot see the question, you see the attendance. Okay, so that reminds me I should copy your attendance. Why does Sartre say that there is no gloomy literature but only good and bad literature? So according to Sartre, by definition literature is a project that is founded on generosity. Therefore, by definition, literature is for freedom, because both writing and reading are acts of freedom. And according to existential philosophy, no individual can have full freedom philosophically. Nobody can be being for itself unless other selves are included in his being. Therefore, to experience full freedom, all human beings must be free. As long as there is any section of people who are not free, nobody can feel freedom, complete freedom. Therefore, by definition, literature cannot be written to support a cause that goes against freedom. Therefore, an evil cause, let us imagine, Sartre imagines or gives the example of anti-Semitism, that is the persecution of the Jews, racial hatred of the Jews. So, can somebody write a novel in favor of this persecution of the Jews? He gives the example of a Negro novelist, a black novelist writing against the oppression of the whites. And Sartre says that as a white European leader, I feel that I am also part of the white race, and therefore I am also culpable. But as a leader, I cannot support oppression, because by definition, the intervention of the leader is an intervention in freedom, exercising his freedom. Therefore, I cannot support an oppression. So, I find joy in reading this novel, even though there the white race is criticized and there is a lot of hatred against the white race expressed in this novel. Therefore, this novel, even though it expresses hatred, which is bad, which is not good, even then this novel is a good novel because it supports freedom. It upholds the cause of freedom of the black race. So, this is one example that he gives, and the other example that he gives is the imaginary example that somebody is writing a novel in support of anti-Semitism. He says that it is simply impossible to write a good novel in support of, not a good novel, to write a novel in support of anti-Semitism. Because it goes against the project of writing. So, literature can never entertain or never allow any evil cause to find expression. And if there were any such literature, that would be true literature. But by definition, there is no such literature. If there is any such thing, it is not literature. So why I am talking all the time, you should also talk from time to time. What according to Sartre is a mistake of the art for art's sake school, I have already discussed that, and Sartre mentions Gautier, the 19th century writer. What according to Sartre is the goal of literature in Why Write? These are two simple questions. Comment on Sartre's moral point of view about literature in Why Write? So, the only question which can, make you think of the paradoxical situation that Sartre writes about work of art being without end, without any utilitarian end. Yet he manages to give us a moralistic theory of art, a didactic theory of art. That appears paradoxical. In bourgeois literature, in the 18th century, there is the Enlightenment period, when the philosophical ideas of utilitarianism, empiricism, encyclopedism, these ideas developed. Rationalism, of course. Then it was conventional to look upon literature as utilitarian. Literature should have some end, some utility. Now this is a very tricky question because, well, long back Horace had written that poetry should be useful and sweet, which means that this theory of utility of literature is also very old. So we will broadly look at this as didacticism, a didactic point of view. You have to understand the subtle difference between the utilitarianism of the 18th century, Enlightenment period, and the traditional didacticism which came down to us from the Greeks and Romans, which suggested even in the Middle Ages, literature always had some kind of morality, some moral message at the end of the story. So this traditional didacticism is different from the utilitarianism of the 18th century, of the Enlightenment period, because the philosophy of Hobbes, Mill, Locke, the kind of utilitarianism they suggested, which was of course a byproduct of Cartesian rationalism and also a development of the continuation of the encyclopedic movement by the encyclopedists, which in French they were called simply philosophes or philosophers. I will write in the chat box. I am writing in plural. Okay. So the French word philosophe means a philosopher, but this word was used to refer to the encyclopedists, Holbach, Diderot, those writers who began to write the encyclopedia. The encyclopedia was written with the view that all knowledge can be summed up, can be classified. And what is the purpose of this very this weighty task of classifying all knowledge, writing encyclopedias? This was based on the understanding that knowledge would ultimately come to some end or purpose that is useful, utility. Knowledge has some utility. So that is why we try to preserve knowledge, we try to write them down, we try to disseminate it because knowledge is useful. So this idea you can understand it is a product of rationalism, where reason was considered the ultimate instrument of knowledge. The Marxist critic Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer wrote a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And in that book, they suggested that reason which was supposed to be pure, that ultimately in the hand of the bourgeoisie was downgraded to or came to be instrumental. Instrumental reason means that you use it as an instrument with an ulterior goal. What is the goal? Earning profit. So, during the 18th century, during the Enlightenment period, Even earlier in the 17th century with Descartes, later in the 18th century, up to the 18th century more or less, reason was still believed to have some kind of purity about it. And in Kant we have two discourses, critique of pure reason and critique of practical reason. So up to Kant there is some kind of idealism involved in this discussion of reason. But Adorno and Horkheimer, they say that the Enlightenment reason, which talked about progress, the philosophy of science, and the belief in progress, which was the great project of the Enlightenment, ultimately for the bourgeoisie, progress meant to be, came to mean making profit by oppressing a class of people. Therefore, they use this rational philosophy as an instrument by which they could oppress others and make undue profit. So Adorno and Horkheimer calls it instrumental reason. So it becomes an instrument of oppression. Science becomes, unfortunately, technology becomes an instrument of oppression instead of progress. So, therefore, utilitarianism became important with the bourgeoisie, and Sartre is reacting against this utilitarianism and therefore taking a non-teleological point of view. So utilitarianism is bad from a Marxist point of view. It leads to oppression of people, it leads to exploitation. Therefore, work of art should not have a teleology, should not have an ultimate end, should not have a utilitarian end. So Sartre criticizes art for art's sake by saying that, suggesting that they were right insofar as they revolted against the utilitarianism of bourgeois reason, bourgeois theory of art. But when they say that the goal of art should be nothing other than art itself, there they went wrong. They made aesthetics a religion instead of finding a true solution philosophically. Therefore, what is the solution? According to Sartre, the philosophical solution can be found in existentialism, and he says that every man must exercise his freedom in order to be being for itself, and writer and reader, they collaborate to project freedom, to imagine freedom, to evoke freedom, to suggest freedom, and therefore a writer writes in a committed manner so that there can be freedom and nobody is oppressed. Alright. And therefore Sartre opposes utilitarian teleological philosophy, but does not support art for art's sake, and proposes that there of course is a morality even in the aesthetic imperative, even though a work of art is basically a work of art. It is for aesthetic joy, and aesthetic joy comes out of two things, two beliefs. One, that this work of art is not utilitarian, it does not have a utilitarian goal, and second, that it makes me aware of my freedom. Therefore, this is the aesthetic imperative of a work of art. But within it lies a moral imperative. What is the moral imperative? That we must exercise our freedom, and we must always talk about freedom and always oppose wherever we see any kind of oppression or lack of freedom. So I have discussed all the questions. Do you have any questions now? There are 15 minutes left, so if you have any questions, you can ask or you can discuss. Rather, you talk. So I thought that I would begin Lucas today, but as it appears, Sartre demands a lot of time from us. And so would appear Lucas and Baudrillard, I am sure, because they are even more difficult than Sartre. However, I think we will have to. Lucas is not difficult, Baudrillard maybe, but okay. But everybody cannot speak in a plain manner. So Sartre suggested that the prose should be very transparent for communication. But later writers, beginning from Derrida, Lacan, then Baudrillard, they all try to write in a difficult manner. So obviously they do not believe in commitment like Sartre. Right. Anyway, do you have any questions?